This was the most insane tank ever made, so insane that even the Soviet Union decided it was too crazy. But what if this insane tank could fly? What if I told you there was a secret Soviet program designing a flying tank? Now I'm gonna tell you all about it. Welcome back to my channel. It's me. And in 1942, Nazi Germany had the Red Army pinned against the wall. The Germans had advanced so far into Russia that they had cut off almost all of the country's industrial capacity and essential supplies. Troops were stuck in defensive positions that were impossible to relieve. And when those troops did retreat, their heavy equipment was left abandoned in the snow. So the Soviet command was forced to abandon the concept of mechanized warfare and deploy large amounts of infantry and artillery onto the front lines. But that meant that the Soviet airborne troops would need an effective way to get new equipment onto the battlefield quickly and en masse. Parachuting tanks seemed like the best solution. But a new problem arose because German air power was so strong. The Soviet cargo planes risked being shot down long before they reached the front lines. So Soviet engineers began sketching out some insane new designs for flying tanks. And what we know today as the world's first flying tank was born. The A-40 was the brainchild of a man named Oleg Antonov, and the idea was deceptively simple. Take an existing Soviet light tank, add wings to it, and drop it out of a bomber while it was flying. But there were more challenges to overcome than you might expect. Tanks weren't designed to fly, and adding wings to the T-60 light tank would throw off its center of gravity so much that the vehicle might just fall apart. But Antonov and his team of engineers found a solution that not only worked, but proved that the tank could actually fly all by itself. But let us go back to 1942. The T-60 light tank was a common sight on the Eastern Front, and at first glance, it looks pretty similar to other Western tanks of the era. It was fast and well-armored enough to be useful in many situations. And the two-man turret was a good design for its day. But under the hood, the T-60 was hiding something important. Its engine and transmission were mounted at the rear of the hull, which freed up space for the crew and allowed the whole thing to be powered by a single diesel engine. That might not sound important, but trust me, it will in a minute. When the engineers at Antonov's factory got the order to come up with a flying tank, they knew exactly what tank to use. The T-60 was small enough to fit inside a bomber's fuselage, but powerful enough to make a difference on the battlefield. But the first challenge was getting the tank out of the plane. Once it was dropped, the tank needed to have a way to detach the wings and land safely without damaging the equipment. So the engineers bolted the wings directly onto the T-60's engine deck. They also added a twin-tail boom to help stabilize the tank while it was gliding to the ground. The T-60 already had a small cockpit with periscopes, but that wouldn't work for flying. So the engineers installed a new control stick and artificial horizon to help guide the tank during its descent. And since the T-60 had a rear-mounted power plant, the wings and tails didn't interfere with the crew's ability to drive the tank. But all of these changes came with a serious downside. The added weight of the wings and tails slowed the tank down by so much that it would never be able to keep up with the rest of the army. But that wasn't really the point of the exercise anyway. The idea was to drop this thing onto the battlefield and have it glide over the last few miles to the fight. After all, the Soviet Air Force already had plenty of fast tanks, but it lacked a good way to deliver them to troops who desperately needed reinforcements. So on December 1942, the first prototype of the A-40 was finished. It was towed behind a TB-3 bomber over the icy plains of the Kotelniki airfield. You might not recognize the name TB-3, but you probably know its American counterpart, the B-24 Liberator. The TB-3 was basically the same plane, but built in the Soviet Union. It was a huge plane with 4 engines and a crew of 10, but it had one major flaw. While it was a great bomber, it was terrible in dogfights. Its top speed was less than 200 miles per hour, and that was with 4 engines running at full throttle. That meant that the A-40 would have to be dropped from an altitude of just 200 feet to avoid detection by German fighters. But it also meant that the crew would have to wait a long time for the glider to reach the ground. On January 1943, the crew climbed into the cockpit of the TB-3 and prepared for the first test flight of the A-40. The plane taxied to the end of the runway and began its takeoff roll. Within seconds, it was airborne and heading toward the south. As the plane gained altitude, the crew spotted a clearing in the forest below them and decided to try releasing the A-40. At this low altitude, there was a good chance that the glider would stall before reaching the ground. But there was nothing to be lost by trying, so the crew released the A-40 and watched as it began its descent. To their surprise, the glider stayed airborne. The crew of the TB-3 watched as the A-40 glided over the trees and landed safely in the clearing. They raced back to the airfield to await the return of the crew. But when they arrived, they found the A-40 sitting abandoned in the middle of a field. The crew had managed to detach the wings and drive the tank away before anyone even realized that they had landed. The Soviet military was so impressed by this feat that they ordered the construction of several more prototypes. But the war soon took a turn and the development of the A-40 was abandoned. There were several reasons why the A-40 never saw widespread use. For one, the extra drag caused by the wings and tails reduced the T-60's top speed by more than half. And since it was so slow, it used up fuel very quickly. Also, the A-40 was extremely unstable, especially during landings. And if it was attacked by German fighters, it would be sitting ducks. The pilots and tank crews who tested the A-40 agreed that it was a dangerous machine to fly, but it was worth the risk. If it meant that they could save lives by delivering tanks to troops who desperately needed them, then it was worth it. But the war was already turning in favor of the Allies, and the A-40 was never given a real chance to prove itself. Despite the fact that it was never used in combat, the A-40 still has a place in aviation history. It proves that the impossible can sometimes become possible, and that even the most outlandish ideas are worth exploring. After the war, the Soviet military wanted to find a way to use the technology developed for the A-40. They considered adding wings to heavier tanks, but quickly realized that it would make the aircraft unmanageable. Instead, they focused on developing lighter vehicles that could be carried by cargo planes and dropped into battle. These vehicles would eventually become the backbone of the Soviet airborne forces, and the A-40 would be credited with helping to develop them. But the story of the A-40 doesn't end there. In the 1970s, the Soviets would revisit the idea of a flying tank when they developed the BMD series of airborne tanks. These vehicles could be parachuted into battle with the crews inside, and they would remain in service for decades. The Soviets were even willing to sacrifice speed and maneuverability for the sake of air delivery, which shows just how useful the A-40 had been. Today, the A-40 is remembered as a curiosity of World War II history. But it was actually a groundbreaking piece of engineering that helped to pave the way for future technologies. Who knows what other crazy ideas the Soviets would have come up with if the war hadn't intervened? But we do know that the A-40 wasn't a failure. It was 30 years ahead of its time. Fast forward to today and you can see the legacy of the A-40 in the vehicles that are currently in service. The U.S. Army's Mobile Protected Firepower System uses a modified Abrams tank as a self-propelled howitzer that can be deployed anywhere on the battlefield. And the British Army's Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance C is a light reconnaissance vehicle that can be carried by cargo planes and deployed to areas of conflict. These vehicles may not be able to fly, but they are the closest thing that we have to the Soviet Union's flying tank. If you love stories like this, make sure to follow for more.